Hello, my beautiful friends, and welcome to the Secrets of a Witch podcast with me, Sabrina Scott, where I talk all about life, love, healing, spirituality, witchcraft, magic, trauma, healing, and everything in between. Sure, I forgot to list out a few things in that little description I just gave, but whatever. If you are new to the podcast, hello and welcome. If you're a returning listener, thank you so much for being here. And this is a little bit of a spitball episode. It is midnight Sunday night as I am recording this, and I've got the lights out. I'm cozy in bed with an oversized sweater with my heating pad on my legs. It's like nice and cozy. And I had just had a jam-packed weekend at an event that I had never heard of before until I randomly found it scrolling Eventbrite of all places, like an elderly person, to look for cool things to do in Toronto. And I found this cool event, Podcamp Toronto, and it was a podcasting conference. Like, what the hell? It was so awesome, and I had an amazing time. And I have so much to say. I have so many thoughts, so much inspiration, so much good vibes. And it was a super thought-provoking weekend, a super interesting weekend. I met so many super cool people, and spoiler alert, the favorite people I met were all like old timers. I don't know how to like say that politely. Like they're all older people, like gray-haired, older folks. And those were all my favorite people that I met. And people were just so generous with their knowledge and just so kind. And I would say 98% of people were very non-pretentious and just very like genuine and real. Like obviously whenever people gather in a space, there's always gonna be like one person or whatever you don't particularly get a great vibe from, but like whatever, who cares? It was overall a really fucking awesome time, and I can't wait to do a full recap. But I wanted to just talk a bit about something that I do see in the podcast space, but I didn't really realize how common this is, I guess, until I really stopped to think about it. But I've seen this in other spaces too, right? Like I've seen this same problem. I consider it a problem anyway, like in illustration spaces. I've seen it in comics. I've seen it pretty much everywhere. So this is not a unique to podcasting problem. And I've even seen it actually with like tarot decks and in the witchy space. So I feel like this is a common situation. And I'm trying to figure out how to describe it. So the vibe I'm describing is when total newbies or like lesser known folks, let's say, inexperienced maybe, want to invite on into their thing that they're making tons of, let's say, like famous people with huge audiences. And this is especially relevant to podcasts, right? Because as I learned at the podcast conference, it seems like most people consider podcasts to be conversations and kind of like a chat show or a talk show or an interview format. And obviously, this podcast is different. It's just me babbling. And I think part of the reason for that is I'm against like this issue that I'm talking about. So, and if anyone is listening to this from the podcast conference, I'm not talking about any of you guys. This is not like a passive aggressive way of saying something about someone that I can't say to their face. If I have a problem with someone, I'm going to say it to their face directly. That's kind of who I am as a person. So this is not passive aggressive. Like I say things to folks with my full chest, and I really don't care. So this is not passive aggressive. This is just more like me noticing a trend in so many different spaces that I just wanted to talk about and like what I think could be done, should be done instead. So what I see is, and again, I've seen this in comics, and I've seen this in illustration, and I'll talk about the way that I've seen it happen. But people will, let's say, want to start a chat show podcast, and they, let's say, have a really small audience, are like not really known, don't really have a clear voice or brand or anything like that, just getting on their feet. And like that's totally legit. Everyone starts somewhere. And I think that's amazing. And I encourage everyone to just fucking do it. Like I had so many conversations this past week with people where I was like, okay, your homework is to record one podcast episode this week. If you have not started it yet, start this week. Why the fuck not? Like just do it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can actually be terrible. Who cares? Just start. Like, I'm very big proponent of just doing it. Perfect is the enemy of the good. Just get it rolling, get it done, start moving. That is how you can start getting better and better and better. Like, I really believe that. So, I have nothing against like novices or folks who are inexperienced about anything, really. Like, I get it. Like, I think that's brave and awesome and important. However, with podcasting, since a lot of people see it as a chat show, like a lot of people then think that, okay, if I get some big fancy guest with a big audience, that is going to catapult my podcast into success. And so some people think that, okay, if I get enough famous people on my show, then I'm going to become famous. All I have to do is just interview famous people. And then, so my problem with this is that people with this mindset usually are relying on the people they invite on to bring the key value to the listener. And I see that as a grift. And I've seen that as a grift in all industries and all spaces. This is not unique to podcasting at all, like in any shape or form. And I just see that I find it offensive. And I've found it offensive again in all mediums. So let me elaborate a little bit here. People with this mindset who are like, okay, all I have to do is interview a bunch of like famous, well-respected people with massive audiences, and then they're going to bring all their genius gems of wisdom to my podcast. Boom, done. It's like the people who are doing it this way, it's like they see it as like, okay, step one, famous person on podcast. Step two, profit. And like I know I'm being like a little bit hyperbolic here, but to me that skips the most important part of the entire equation, which is like who the fuck are you? And what makes you a good interviewer or someone that I even give a shit about listening to? And not to be rude, but I think people often will sidestep the development of their own voice, the development of their own brand, the development of their own perspective, and will just be like, no, I can constantly rely on other people to bring the value. And I see it as this kind of like piggybacking on the hard work that other people have already done to build audiences or to have insights or whatever it happens to be. And so some of you guys might be like, Sabrina, you're such an asshole. Like, why would you say that? So let me give you an example. So one of my favorite conversational podcasts that I really love listening to is Diary of a CEO. I think it's great. Stephen Bartlett is the host, and he's lovely. And part of the reason his show is so fucking good, and the interviews range from, I would say, like an hour to 3.5 hours, is he is such an amazing interviewer. Like his vibe is inquisitive, gentle, intimate. Like he has this way of framing things, of leading into questions where he'll talk about his own vulnerabilities or challenges, and then he will lead that into a question with the guests, and it will inspire people to open up, and you really get some juicy, cool stuff. But if Steven was not a good interviewer and he didn't have his own rich life experience as a successful entrepreneur uh to mine from and to bring into the conversation, the conversations would be significantly flatter than they are, and they're not flat at all. Like they're really interesting, and they have this beautiful topography to them. And so each person that conversation, and he is interviewing some serious heavyweights, they are both bringing a significant amount of value to that conversation. And so I see with a lot of people who like have, let's say, want to do a chat show on a podcast or whatever, it's like a lot of folks have not honed their unique perspective and their skills, let's say, to the point where they are contributing significant value. And a lot of people want to skip that step. They don't want to do that work of self-development. They don't want to interview, let's say, smaller creators or people who are not famous, famous, famous. Because then they're like, oh, that's not going to do well for my show. No one's going to watch it because no one knows who this person is that I'm interviewing. It's like, guess what, buddy? No one knows who you are either. So humble yourself and start somewhere. And I think no one is above doing that hard work of self-development, no matter what you're creating and no matter what sphere or industry or community you're in. And I saw this recently with this is gonna make me sound like an asshole too. Sorry, guys. There was a local tarot deck project where I don't really fucking know the details. Like I hate this type of project where they invited a bunch of artists. I think it was probably 78 artists to do like a full tarot deck. Like, and I've seen people do this shit before. Like as a tarot reader, like I find those decks to be like incoherent, to be honest, and kind of useless. Like they can be fun collector's art items, I guess. But what I see them as more often than not is a grift and a money grab because then you've got 78 artists telling everyone they know, oh, guess what? I'm involved in this cool tarot deck or whatever it is. And then they sell it. They're going to buy a copy. Their friends are going to buy a copy. Oh, my friend is in a tarot deck. Profit. And the organizer, let's say, or like person whose idea this was, is like then they get to have their name be amplified off the work of all these other people who are probably, and this is how I've always seen it happen, who are way more well known than the original organizer, who was basically just doing it for clout. And I hate everything about that, like for so many reasons. I saw it happen when I was a little undergrad illustration student, and I would see people create these like zine anthologies around a theme around whatever the hell it was. And they would invite all these like famous artists to participate. And like most people would say yes, because like the concept was usually pretty interesting. But it's like then I did know, and this is I guess a genius move for these people, these organizers of these zines. And then they would get the clout. They would get known because they decided to organize this thing, basically grifting off of the audience of all these like famous artists, let's say. And this isn't to say that I think everyone should stay in their lane, so to speak, quote unquote. Like, no, like I do believe in ambition. I do believe in punching above our weight. I do believe in striving and asking, and people can only say no. And if they say no, like that's fine. So on one hand, like I get it. I think the hustle is awesome. Like reach for the stars, why not? But the flip side of it is okay, yeah, so now you've got the clout, you've got the connections, whatever. But it's like, but are you a good artist? But are you making good art? Are you making good content? Is your writing good? I've seen this in writing anthologies as well. A lot of people, let's say, are not the greatest writers, but they are trying to build, let's say, some clout off of the backs of other people. And so bringing it back to podcasting, it's like, okay, and so who are you to be, let's say, having these conversations? And on one hand, it's like, yes, reach for the stars, YOLO, you know, ask always. And if people say no, hey, it's no skin off your back, absolutely. On the flip side, what I don't like is when people skip the necessary process of honing their skill set. And maybe this is on my mind because this year I've decided to read this book by, oh my God, what is this guy's name? Robert Greene. And of course, you guys probably know he has a bunch of very interesting books about power and seduction and mastery. And the book I'm reading every day of his now is Daily Laws. And so there is one law from kind of scrambled from his different books and his different content releases and everything. And there's one thing every day. And the theme for February, as far as I can remember, is around apprenticeship and skill building. And one of the things that he keeps talking about as I'm reading day to day, so it's super front of mind, is that you can't skip the steps of building your skills. You can't skip the all of that hard work that will result in you being good. You can't just snap your fingers and then all of a sudden you are good or you're expert or you're talented. Like you actually have to read the books. If this is the case for something intellectual, you have to spend a lot of time drawing and making art. If you're a visual artist, you have to spend the time in the gym if that's more your thing. Or if you're a dancer, you got to go to the dance practice. If you're a podcaster, let's say, you got to like practice recording, you got to practice public speaking or speaking at all. And practice makes perfect. And I think what bugs me just about this whole cluster of topics is that people want to skip the work. They just want to be like, put in the most minimum amount of effort and then skip to the profit part, skip to the fame part. And that shit is great, like who doesn't want that? Like, I'm sure there's some people who don't, but I'm sure a lot of us do want that. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, like the only way any of that can ever be sustainable and fulfilling mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically is if we actually put in the time, do the work, and enjoy the process rather than just seeing it as a means to an end. Like we have to enjoy building up our skills. That has to be like a journey as a destination thing in a sense. Like if the goal is to just skip doing the hard work of building that particular talent, what are we really doing here? Like what is the point? Like why? And so that's just my little ramble, you guys. Don't skip the hard stuff. Don't skip the process. Like the process and the mess and the trial and error and the confusion and the frustration, like all of that is where the magic starts to happen. All of that is how we become who we really are in life, obviously. And in, let's say, business or creativity or anything that we're doing, the mess is the point. The learning is the point. The iteration, the constant repetition, the trying, all of that is the point. And if we're going to relate this to the tarot, as I love to do, the vibe here is very Eight of Pentacles. Head down, repetition, doing what we need to do. There's also a Three of Pentacles vibe here too, like an apprenticeship of a sort. It's so important to revel in the process and to take joy in the process. And I know that is super cliche to say, but I think it's crucial. And someone at the podcasting conference, I really enjoyed his talk actually. I forget what his name is off the top of my head. If anyone's curious, I'm sure I'll say it in another form of recap. 'Cause it's not really a recap, it's kind of like a ramble. He was saying that no, you don't necessarily deserve an audience. Like the audience doesn't like owe you its attention. And he phrased it likely much more eloquently. You don't deserve an audience, I think is what he said. And I think that's true. And it's a bit of a bitch slap, but I do think it's true, right? Like, so his perspective, as I understood it, seemed to be you have to earn it. You have to be good. You have to be good. And I think this is my issue with many people who, let's say, just want to grift off of the famous interview guest. And it's like, why should anyone give a fuck about you as an interviewer? What is your unique perspective? And I find the interviews that I enjoy listening to the most, it's when I respect and really enjoy the work of both people. So the conversation is not like a little intern asking some giant questions, so that can absolutely be an interesting format. But it's a conversation between two people who are both on a more equal playing field. And so I always want to elevate myself as much as possible in terms of skill set, learning, like skill building, really. I want to keep developing my thought process, my analytical skills, my rhetorical skills. And I see that as a bit of my responsibility as someone who does make a living creating. It's really weird to say that at the conference this weekend, because I was like, yeah, I'm a full-time creator, I guess, which has been the case for a long time. And it's kind of crazy to say it, but it's like, oh yeah, it's true, it's true. And part of the reason why I'm always learning, always growing, always reading is like I don't want to stagnate. I'm not worried that I'm going to get boring. Like I don't think that's possible. But at the same time, I'm always learning more information. I'm always hungry to get better, to learn, to grow, to improve. And I think sometimes when people are like, "Oh, I'm just gonna go interview a famous person," or "Oh, I'm just gonna ask to collaborate with a famous artist," like that might be well and good, and they very well might say yes, and that might be a really awesome experience. But at the end of the day, it's like wherever you go, there you are. And so I do think it is each of our own responsibility as people on this planet, whether you're a public creator or not, to bring value into all of our relationships. And I realize that sounds a very marketing-y thing to say. It's like totally not how I mean it. But what I mean by that is it's our responsibility, I believe, as people to be improving ourselves at all times, or most times, or at least a lot of the time, and also improving the lives of others. Like, we want to be creating a positive ripple effect. I really do not believe in using other people or that kind of climbing, like kind of slimy, utilitarian way of looking at relationships. Like, I do not look at art that way. I do not look at community that way. I don't look at business that way. I don't look at life that way, you know? I don't care what someone could quote unquote do for me if I don't like them as a person or if I find myself incompatible with their values and their ways of treating people. Then I'm not going to compromise who I am in order to get that benefit. I don't believe in get out of jail free cards. I don't believe in fast tracking, really. It's all about growth of the self, cultivating the self, bringing value. And again, I know I started off this talking about podcasts and interviews and people wanting to skip that step of developing a voice. And I'm sure most of you guys listening to this don't have podcasts, and that's totally cool. If you want to start one, you should. It's not that hard. At the same time, it's like I do think this is so relevant to everybody, whether you're a podcaster, a creator, or just a human in the world. We shouldn't be skipping steps. We're probably going to be having to make up for that later, right? When we skip steps, when we try to fast track and run before we're walking, we end up missing out on the magic of life. We end up missing out on learning significant things about ourselves and forcing ourselves to just struggle through the process of learning something. I do think this gets easier as we get older, so we realize looking silly doesn't fucking matter, and revealing to other people that we're new at something is actually not embarrassing at all. It's actually kind of awesome. And so that's my ramble. Let's just not skip the steps. Let's just all be the best we can be. And I know I'm being a bit cheesy right now. It's my midnight brain talking. So those are just some initial raw thoughts. And I'm really excited to talk more about the podcast conference. It was a really fun mix of people who really came from such different walks of life. There were a few younger student type of folks. There were a few people who were much older. There was one guy who seemed to be in his like 70s or 80s or something. Like he was so interesting. And there was a bunch of corporate research people, and then there was a super DIY, like zine-like podcast people. So it was so interesting. It's like the conversations between big and small approaches to media, like the authorship model of podcasting, let's say. That's my own kind of terminology I'm using here, versus the like big corporate podcasting. It reminded me so much of conversations in witchcraft spaces, but also in comics. As you guys all probably know, like I come from like the zine DIY comics space, and then there's of course those big like superhero DC Marvel completely different things. And so of course similar conversations are happening around podcasting, and so those conversations were super neat. There was, let's see. Oh, Awa says hello. I don't know if you guys can hear her meowing, but there were just so many interesting conversations around so many different aspects of podcasting, including like the future of podcasting. Is video necessary? Where are people discovering podcasts? And what I really loved was so many of the presenters disagreed with each other, and which I think is amazing. Like what I would have loved to have seen would have been like a panel where people could duke it out. Maybe I'll suggest that for next year. I actually want to try to give a talk there next year. So it was really neat. And I'll probably do an Instagram live to recap some of it in a little bit more of a chill way. We'll see if anyone does have any questions around the podcast conference and you've got some questions around what I've learned, or if there was a topic that you were super interested in, if you got any questions, I'm happy to answer to the best of my ability, either based on my own experience with podcasting that I've done like 200 episodes almost, which I didn't really realize was that big of a deal, but everyone was like so complimentary and like, wow, congratulations at the podcast conference thing. I was like, wow, I guess it kind of is a lot of episodes. Um, well, so maybe I do kind of know a few things about this. But if anyone's got any questions, again, reach out to me. You guys know how to do that most likely. And I would love to answer your questions either in a podcast episode, on Instagram Live, maybe YouTube Live, whatever. And can't wait to keep talking about this. I'm going to go to sleep now. And I'm sure you guys are listening to this at whatever random times. I'm not uploading it right away. So there will be a little bit of lag between recording and posting. Also upcoming soon in podcast land here is some episodes around the Gabby Petito Netflix documentary that came out recently. And I do have so much to say about it, but more around abusive relationships, how to tell if you're in one, why love kind of is irrelevant and absolutely is not enough. Obviously, I believe in love, you guys. I'm a total romantic, but I do see a lot of people staying in really bad situations just because they are in love and they love the person. So I have a lot to say about that, and and yeah, that's what's coming up. So as you guys know, you can find me at sabrinamscott.com and on Instagram, Sabrina M. Scott. YouTube is just Sabrina Scott. My email is ceo@sabrinamscott.com. I'm gonna go to bed now, friends. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have found this thought-provoking, interesting. I don't know. That's what I hope anyway. Please give this a happy rating. It really is super helpful for discoverability, as I have learned at the podcast conference. Please give me a happy rating and a nice review. And please tell your friends if you have found this episode interesting or any other episodes of this show. If there's anything that you would like to request as an episode, I'm totally happy to hear your suggestions. I'll probably listen to you and answer all of your questions in an episode. All right, friends. That's it for now. Talk to you later. Bye.